On the morning of the 23rd of April, 1951, a lieutenant colonel received a warning order with approximately 4 hours to prepare. He had 700 men, no mines, no barbed wire, no time to register his artillery before dark, and a valley 7 kilometers wide that doctrine held required several times his strength to defend. He had American tanks that would leave before the night was finished, American mortar companies that would walk away from the battle without orders, and an enemy force moving south through the dark in numbers that would not be confirmed until the counting was done afterward. He had, in the preceding 24 hours, watched the South Korean division holding the ground north of him dissolve so completely that its commander lost communication with every unit he commanded. He had also, in the preceding 6 months, buried 32 soldiers and spent 7 months in continuous operations without rotation. Tell me in the comments, have you heard of the Battle of Kapyong before today? Because if you haven't, that is the first thing this story needs to address. The commander of the American forces sent to relieve that valley after the fighting ended produced a formal assessment of what the Australians had accomplished. By the end of this, you will understand exactly what it said and exactly what it cost. To understand how 700 Australians stopped what the arithmetic of the situation said could not be stopped, you first have to understand what kind of war Korea was and what it had already taken from the men fighting it before that morning arrived. The Korean War is remembered in Australia, to the extent it is remembered at all, as the war between the Second World War and Vietnam. That positioning is itself a kind of erasure. More than 18,000 Australians served in it. 340 were killed during the war. More than 1,200 were wounded. 30 were taken prisoner. The conflict lasted 3 years, involved 21 nations under a United Nations mandate, and ended not in victory or defeat, but in an armistice that left the peninsula divided at almost exactly the line where it had been divided when the fighting began. The war achieved its objective and left almost nothing behind it that looked like triumph. It was the first conflict of the Cold War era authorized by the United Nations Security Council, and the first time the battalion of the Royal Australian Regiment went to war. That last fact mattered enormously by the time April 1951 arrived, for reasons that were not visible in September of 1950, when the battalion landed. The battalion that arrived at Busan in late September of 1950 was not, by the assessment of the Chief of the General Staff, Lieutenant General Sidney Rowell, ready for what it was being sent to do. It was under strength, underarmed, and undertrained. The precise phrase Rowell used was that the battalion was simply not battle-worthy. What the battalion was about to discover across the 7 months between that assessment and the morning of the 23rd of April is that readiness is partly a condition you arrive with and partly a condition you accumulate under fire. The Korean Peninsula proceeded to resolve the question the only way such questions can be resolved. Seoul, the South Korean capital, had changed hands 4 times before the April offensive began. North Korean forces had taken it in the first days of the war in June of 1950. United Nations forces had retaken it in September. Chinese intervention in November had driven UN forces south of it again. By March of 1951, UN forces had retaken it a 3rd time during Operation Ripper. The city had become a measuring instrument for the war's direction, and whoever held Seoul held the claim to be winning. The Chinese Spring Offensive that began on the night of the 22nd of April had as its immediate objective the taking of it a 4th time. The offensive was not a local operation. What the Chinese People's Volunteer Army assembled for the 5th phase campaign was arithmetically vast. More than 700,000 men across 2 broad fronts. The main thrust, 337,000 troops, crossed the Imjin River in the western sector toward Seoul. The secondary effort, 149,000 troops, moved through the central and eastern sectors, falling primarily on the United States 9 Corps. A further 214,000 troops supported the offensive. The objective was the total destruction of the United States Voronezh Corps above the Han River, with Seoul as the prize that made the arithmetic worth the cost. The context in which this offensive arrived mattered beyond its numbers. General Douglas MacArthur had been dismissed by President Truman on the 11th of April, 1951, 12 days before Kapyong. MacArthur had made public statements about the advisability of detonating between 26 and 32 tactical nuclear weapons along the Chinese border. Truman dismissed him for insubordination. General Matthew Ridgway replaced him as Commander-in-Chief. General James Van Fleet replaced Ridgway as commander of the United States 8th Army on the 14th of April, 9 days before the battle. The command structure that would manage the most dangerous moment of the Korean War had been in its current configuration for less than a fortnight when the Chinese launched. The South Korean 6th Division held the northern end of the Kapyong Valley. They had sent patrols forward in the days before the offensive. Those patrols returned without finding the enemy. The Chinese moved large formations quickly and stealthily, and the 9th Corps intelligence apparatus had, by its own later admission, little idea of the strength of the forces it was about to face. The 6th Division's commanders had nevertheless anticipated an attack. The divisional commander, General Chang Do-yong, halted his advance at 4 o'clock on the afternoon of the 22nd and ordered his 2 forward regiments to tie in and develop defensive positions. They were given 1 hour. They left the valleys and flanks exposed. What struck them at 5 o'clock came through precisely those gaps. 2 Chinese divisions hit the South Korean formation simultaneously. The 118th Division of the 40th Army and the 60th Division of the 20th Army infiltrated through the poorly organized positions almost immediately. By 11 o'clock that night, General Chang had lost all communication with every unit he commanded. The soldiers of the 6th Division abandoned their weapons, their equipment, and their vehicles. They dissolved as a fighting formation and became something else, a river of frightened men and civilians moving south through the valley, carrying nothing but their speed, with Chinese forces following closely behind and sometimes moving intermingled within. The 16th Field Regiment of the Royal New Zealand Artillery, attached to the South Koreans to provide fire support, found itself nearly cut off and was withdrawn in the night. The following morning, reports suggested the South Koreans were making a stand, and the guns were sent back up the valley. By dusk, those reports were confirmed false. The regiment withdrew again. 60 kilometers to the south, the 27th British Commonwealth Brigade was in reserve positions near the village of Kapyong, enjoying what amounted to the most comfortable days it had experienced since arriving in Korea. Beer rations had arrived. Men were bathing for the first time in several weeks. A cinema had been operating, its first screening interrupted when a lighted cigarette ignited a small drum of petrol, an explosion that injured no one and generated a story told for years after. Among the chestnut trees near the reserve area, wreaths were being woven from azaleas gathered that week. A flagpole had been erected. Rock-edged paths were laid around the position. Lieutenant Colonel Bruce Ferguson had invited representatives of the nearby Turkish Brigade to join the Australians on the 25th of April for the Anzac Day ceremony, the commemoration of the Gallipoli landing in 1915, the campaign in which Australians and Turks had first tried to kill one another and produced, across that effort, a mutual respect that had outlasted the century. The ceremony they had planned would not take place. At 8:30 on the morning of the 23rd, Brigadier Brian Burke received the warning order. The brigade was to move forward to defend the northern approaches to Kapyong. Battalion and company commanders began their reconnaissances. The men weaving azalea wreaths set them down unfinished. They would mark Anzac Day differently. Kapyong sits astride Route 17, the main road running south from the 38th parallel toward Seoul. The valley at the point the brigade was ordered to defend was 7 kilometers wide, far too large for the available force to establish any continuous defensive line. Two prominent hills rose on either side of the road. Hill 504 sat to the east of the river. Hill 677 rose to the west. A third dominant feature, Sudak San, nearly 800 meters high, rose massively to the northwest and was left undefended by necessity. There were no troops available to put on it. The brigade had been reduced to 3 battalions. The Argyll and Sutherland Highlanders had departed for embarkation to Hong Kong days before the battle. The Middlesex Regiment was on standby for their own rotation and would be held in reserve. The 3rd Battalion, Royal Australian Regiment, was assigned Hill 504. The 2nd Battalion, Princess Patricia's Canadian Light Infantry, was assigned Hill 677. Before following them to those hills, it is necessary to understand who they were. The 3rd Battalion, Royal Australian Regiment, had been in continuous operations since landing at Pusan in late September of 1950, the unit whose readiness had been formally questioned before a shot was fired. The battalion the Chief of the General Staff had judged not battle-worthy in September had fought the apple orchard action at Yongju in October, the first combat operation in the Royal Australian Regiment's history. It had advanced toward the Chinese border in the weeks before Chinese intervention, then turned and retreated south through the North Korean winter, along roads frozen hard enough to injure men who fell on them. It had fought its way back north across the 38th parallel in the months that followed. The men still in its 4 rifle companies by the 23rd of April were experienced in a way that cannot be manufactured outside of continuous operations. By the time the armistice came in July of 1953, they would carry the name Old Faithful, given to them because the battalion was present from the first engagement to the last day, never rotated out as other battalions were, always returned to the line. On the 23rd of April, the name had not yet been earned. They were simply the battalion sent forward because the brigade had run out of alternatives. Lieutenant Colonel Ian Bruce Ferguson commanded them. Born on the 13th of April, 1917, in Wellington, New Zealand, the only child of parents who divorced early. His mother remarried a Reuters journalist who carried the family across Wellington, Melbourne, London, Paris, and Dunedin as the work required. Ferguson had been a cadet journalist at the Sydney Sun when the Second World War was declared. He enlisted on the 3rd of November, 1939, and served at Bardia and Tobruk in Syria and Egypt, down the Kokoda Trail, and to Sanananda on the New Guinea coast. The 2nd Battalion could muster only 88 of 550 men when it came out of the line there. His arrival in command of the 3rd Battalion was sudden. The previous commanding officer, Lieutenant Colonel Charles Green, was killed in October of 1950 by a single shell fragment that pierced his tent while he was resting, just after the Battle of Chongju. The shell struck a tree above the tent. One fragment came through the canvas. Ferguson took command on the 8th of November, 1950. The connection between that death and the battle ahead ran through Major Bernard O'Dowd. O'Dowd commanded A Company, the company that would hold the most exposed ground on Hill 504 on the forward slopes facing the valley. Charles Green had been O'Dowd's mentor. O'Dowd had been the officer who sighted Green's tent after the Battle of Chongju, had placed it in the position where the fragment found it. That is not the kind of fact that appears in citation language. It is the kind a man carries without being asked. Private John Murphy of 1st Platoon, a company, would occupy the forward-most positions on Hill 504, the furthest point from the valley floor, the first ground the Chinese would reach coming up the slope. He was the youngest voice in the battle. He survived it. The 3rd Company commander who requires introduction is Captain Reginald Walter Saunders, known as Reggie, commanding C Company. He was born on the 7th of August, 1920, on the Framlingham Aboriginal Reserve near Purnham in western Victoria, a member of the Gunditj Mara people. His family had been at war across 3 generations before Kapyong. His father, Chris Saunders, had served in the First World War. His uncle, William Reginald Rawlings, for whom Reg was named, had served in the 29th Battalion in France, won the military medal, and was killed at Vauvillers in 1918. Another ancestor had fought in the Boer War. When Saunders enlisted in 1940, he followed a tradition that reached back to before Australia's federation. His brother Harry enlisted alongside him. Harry was killed in New Guinea. Saunders himself was shot in the knee in a separate action in New Guinea, recovered, and returned to the line. He went before an officer selection board at the Atherton Tablelands in Queensland, was assessed as suitable for commissioning, and was sent to an officer training unit in Seymour, Victoria. He graduated as a lieutenant in November of 1944, becoming the first Aboriginal Australian commissioned as an officer in the Australian Army. The paperwork required confirmation from the Commander-in-Chief, General Sir Thomas Blamey, for personal approval. The reason recorded was the appointment's special significance. The Army was formally concerned about the precedent it was setting. Blamey approved it. Saunders served. After the Second World War, he was discharged into a civilian society that did not extend to him what it extended to the men who had fought beside him. He was not eligible for a soldier settlement block. The returned soldiers' educational opportunities available to white veterans were not available to him. He worked as a tram conductor, a foundry worker, a shipping clerk. He re-enlisted for Korea in August of 1950. He arrived in Korea in November, served first as a platoon commander in A Company, took command of C Company in March of 1951. At Kapyong, he was the first Aboriginal serviceman to command a rifle company in the Australian Army. He had a verdict ready about what the battle meant. He would deliver it when the fighting was done. By mid-afternoon on the 23rd, these men and 700 others were on the hills above Kapyong. The afternoon was spent digging weapon pits where the rocky ground permitted and stacking sangars of stone where it did not. Lieutenant Kenneth Koch of the 72nd United States Heavy Tank Battalion deployed his 15 Sherman tanks in support of the Australians. One platoon covered the road forward of B Company to the north. One platoon occupied higher ground west of B Company. Koch's command tank and the remaining platoon sat near battalion headquarters, covering a ford across the Kapyong River 800 meters south. The artillery forward observers had not yet reached the company positions. Defensive fire tasks could not be registered before dark. The night was coming without that preparation. The first indication of what approached arrived as the light began to fail. Private Murphy was on the forward slope. We could hear the shots following the Chinese as they started to intermingle with the South Koreans and refugees, he said. The sound was not distant. It was immediately above the valley floor, moving south. We knew that we were going to be in for it, Murphy said. Sure enough, we heard the whistles going. South Korean soldiers and civilians were streaming through the brigade position in growing numbers by early evening. Chinese forces deliberately intermingled among them. Captain O'Dowd identified the problem at once. He contacted the officer commanding B Company to suggest establishing a checkpoint to separate the refugees from the soldiers moving with them. The advice was not acted upon. Shortly afterward, firing broke out from the direction of battalion headquarters in the low ground near the river, confirming precisely what O'Dowd had warned against. A Chinese force had infiltrated behind the Australian positions through the gap the checkpoint would have caught. The battalion was partially surrounded before the main assault began. The American Sherman tanks forward of B Company were overrun in the early evening and fell back. The mortar companies remained in position. They would not still be there by morning. The Chinese People's Volunteer Army attacked at night when it could. This was not preference, but calculation. American air superiority was decisive in daylight, and in darkness it disappeared. The tactical method employed against the Australian position was known as 1.2 sides, massed forces and infiltration to achieve local numerical superiority, penetrating the gaps between forward companies, then attempting envelopment while drawing defensive fire to the front. Command and control below battalion level operated by whistle blasts, bugle calls, and runners. There was no radio below that level. It made the attacks powerful and, once launched, often inflexible. At approximately midnight on the 23rd of April, 1951, the assault on Hill 504 began. There is a detail about the Chinese approach that the battle's aftermath clarified. The vanguard moving south through the valley was intent on capturing the Route 17 crossroads at Kapyong, and appears to have been largely unaware that Australians were dug in on Hill 504. The long, low ridge rising at the valley's mouth split the Chinese advance as they came up against it. The discovery of the Australian position was mutual and nearly simultaneous. It cost the Chinese time and momentum in the opening phase. It didn't cost them enough. A company held the longest ridgeline on Hill 504, running from the lower slopes up to the summit where D Company was positioned. The Chinese came up that face in successive waves, each one advancing over the dead and wounded of the wave preceding it, using what had fallen as both cover and direction. The gap that formed along a company's ridge was found and exploited. Chinese machine gunners established themselves in it. They were eventually eliminated. The gap had existed because a company did not have enough men to cover every meter of the ground it had been assigned. That was known before the battle began. It had been assessed, acknowledged, and accepted, because there was no alternative to accepting it. B Company, on a small knoll near the river, spent the night in its own fight. At dawn, its position produced one of the battle's most compressed moments. Chinese soldiers discovered in old bunkers on an adjacent knoll. Grenades and bayonets followed. C Company under Saunders held a spur in support of both forward companies, repelling assault after assault directed at the battalion's flanks through the night. D Company on the summit endured repeated attacks with the support of New Zealand artillery that had established observer links after dark. Sometime during the night, a separate Chinese force attacked battalion headquarters in the low ground by the river. Ferguson withdrew himself and his staff to a new location. Captain Girk, commanding the headquarters defense, was not informed of the move. He spent time searching the battlefield for his commanding officer. At 6 o'clock in the morning, a jeep arrived from the relocated headquarters with the message, "Bug out. Battalion HQ is back down the road." Gurkha withdrew his vehicles one at a time under covering fire, successfully completed the move, and was then ordered to secure a ford 2 kilometers east as a potential evacuation route. He accomplished that also. These facts are in the record. They sit alongside what the companies held through that same night, and the record contains both. The American mortar companies had gone. Lieutenant Colonel James Stone of the Canadian Battalion on Hill 677 documented it in plain language. When the battle got hot on the Australian front, Stone said, "The forward observation officer for the U.S. mortars on my front walked out, and never a pop did we get from his company." The 2 United States chemical mortar companies departed the battlefield without orders, hiking approximately 16 kilometers east before stopping. They left behind their mortars, their guns, their supplies, and 50 loaded trucks. In total, 5 companies of American and British forces attached to the 27th Brigade left the battlefield without authorization that night, convinced that a major Chinese breakthrough was imminent. Stone's characterization of the broader pattern was unambiguous. Bug-outs, he said, were the accepted manner of withdrawing. The Australians on Hill 504 received none of this information. Communication was gone. They knew only what the ground beneath them was telling them, which was that the Chinese continued to come. On the morning of the 24th of April, Major O'Dowd directed his radio operator to call for any available support. The American 1st Marine Division answered. The operator refused to believe Australians were on the line. O'Dowd took the phone and demanded to speak to the commanding general. Private Patrick Knowles, who was present, recorded what followed. The general informed O'Dowd that his company did not exist, that they had been wiped out the night before. O'Dowd's response was 4 words. "I've got news for you," he said. "We are still here and we are staying here." A company was still there in precisely the sense O'Dowd meant. They had held the ground through the night. They had not slept. They were running short of what a forward company needs to continue holding ground. But they were there. Daylight brought American aircraft. At some point in the afternoon, United States Corsair aircraft arrived over Hill 504. American command had concluded, on the basis of the previous night's assault, that no one could have survived on the hill. The aircraft were briefed accordingly. Napalm dropped onto D Company's positions on the summit. 2 men were killed. Several others were severely burned. Private Murphy remembered what followed. "We had to tend to them," he said, "and when the fighting withdrawal was on, we had to carry them out." The burned men were carried. Some were carried by the men of the battalion still capable of walking. Some were carried, during the withdrawal that came later, by 40 Chinese prisoners captured in the course of the battle. That detail, Australian wounded, carried out by Chinese prisoners during a fighting withdrawal under fire, exists in the historical record without ceremony or annotation. By midday on the 24th, the tactical position had become what military planners call untenable. The Sherman tanks had withdrawn. The mortar companies were 16 kilometers away. A second Chinese regiment was deploying for a fresh assault. Resupply was effectively impossible through ground, the enemy now occupied, and casualties could not be reliably evacuated. Brigadier Burke made the decision to withdraw the Australian battalion from Hill 504 to positions behind the Middlesex Regiment. Ferguson ordered O'Dowd to plan and lead the movement. A fighting withdrawal is among the most demanding maneuvers in military doctrine. The probability that a unit withdrawing under contact will collapse into a rout is substantial. That probability increases in darkness, over difficult terrain, with wounded to carry and an enemy prepared to pursue. The withdrawal of the 3rd Battalion, Royal Australian Regiment, from Hill 504, conducted after last light on the 24th, under continuous enemy pressure, with the burned men being carried alongside 40 prisoners, covered by New Zealand artillery, laying fire over the retreating column, has been described by historian Bob Breen as a superb military feat. O'Dowd planned it and led it. No formal recognition of that planning appeared in any subsequent award citation. Ferguson received the Distinguished Service Order for his command at Kapyong. The battalion would receive the United States Presidential Unit citation. The withdrawal O'Dowd designed and executed is not named in either document. After midnight on the 25th of April, 1951, the last Australians entered positions held by the Middlesex Regiment. It was now Anzac Day. The azalea wreaths were unfinished at the reserve area 30 kilometers south. The flagpole was standing. The Turkish guests had not come. The ceremony these men marked instead was a fighting withdrawal in the dark, over ground that a Marine general had told them they were not standing on, carrying their burned men and their prisoners into a line held by soldiers who had waited for them. That was the day. The Canadians on Hill 677 had watched the Australian withdrawal. They understood what it meant for their own position. Lieutenant Colonel Stone had refused to allow his men to leave. Surrounded, supply lines severed, resupplied only by aircraft dropping materials into a perimeter under assault. Stone's calculation was that the hill was a critical point and that losing it would open the road south with nothing positioned to close it. He was right. Canadian soldier Gerald Gowing remembered the encirclement without diminishment. "We were surrounded on the hills of Kapyong, and there was a lot of fire," Gowing said. We were pretty well out of ammunition, and out of food, too. We did get some air supplies dropped in, but we were actually surrounded. That was a scary moment, let me tell you. In one engagement during the night of the 24th, a Canadian company of approximately 100 men held off 4 times that number. In the most desperate moment of the Canadian defense, Company Commander Captain J. W. Mills called for artillery from the 16th New Zealand Field Regiment onto his own position. The New Zealanders fired more than 2,000 shells. The entrenched Canadians survived in their weapon pits. The Chinese attacking across open ground did not. It was not a gamble in the mind of the man who called it. It was a calculation about which risk was greater. A smaller engagement took place at the Canadian Battalion headquarters when approximately 500 Chinese attacked the position directly. A soldier named Hub Gray commanded the mortar and machine gun unit at headquarters that absorbed the attack. His men held. The assault broke apart. Gray received no decoration for it, and no recognition until 2003, when the Governor-General of Canada granted him a coat of arms decades after the fact. By morning of the 25th of April, the 3 Chinese regiments that had assaulted the Kapyong Valley had retired north. The United States 5th Cavalry Regiment arrived and advanced toward Hill 504 that afternoon, recapturing the hill and the hamlet of Chuktunni. On the 26th, the 5th Cavalry relieved the Canadian defenders. The 1st United States Cavalry Division, the formation that had come to take over what the Australians and Canadians had held, occupied the ground and began its assessment. The counting that followed produced these figures. 3rd Battalion, Royal Australian Regiment, 32 killed, 59 wounded, 3 taken prisoner. 2nd Battalion, Princess Patricia's Canadian Light Infantry, 10 killed, 23 wounded. The 16th Field Regiment, Royal New Zealand Artillery, 2 killed, 5 wounded. The United States Tank Crews, 3 killed, 12 wounded, 2 Shermans destroyed. The 5th Cavalry Regiment in the subsequent counteroffensive, 10 killed. Against these numbers, estimates of Chinese losses run to approximately 6,000 killed across the full duration of the engagement. The Australian War Memorial records that the Chinese 60th Division alone suffered more than 500 killed. A casualty rate of roughly 1 in 3 among the forces engaged. The 3rd Battalion had faced, on Hill 504 alone, the better part of the Chinese 118th Division, a force estimated at approximately 10,000 men, directed specifically against that position. The total Chinese force operating in the Kapyong sector during the full battle was perhaps twice that number. 2nd Lieutenant Dennis Fielden of the 16th New Zealand Field Regiment was one of the 2 New Zealanders killed. 32 years old, born in England, he had served 7 years with the Royal Air Force and the Royal Artillery before Korea. He had been serving as a forward observation officer with a company of the 3rd Battalion on Hill 504. When the Chinese came in the early hours of the 24th, his signaller was asleep. Fielden was told to move. He was killed leaving his position to do so. He was the first New Zealander killed in the Korean War. He was mentioned in dispatches posthumously. Private Horace William Madden, called Slim, called Digger, was a signalsman attached to battalion headquarters when Chinese forces captured him on the 24th of April, 1951. He had been concussed before capture. He was 30 years old. His service record before Korea included ambulance work in New Guinea and Bougainville during the Second World War, service with the British Commonwealth Occupation Force in Japan afterward, and 2 years working as a mental health nurse at Morisset Hospital in New South Wales. He re-enlisted for Korea in 1950. From the time of his capture, Madden resisted. He verbally abused his captors when they beat him. He maintained, in the recorded testimony of his fellow prisoners, an unbroken spirit across months of increasing deprivation. He was systematically deprived of food as punishment for his defiance, and gave what little he obtained to other prisoners who needed it more urgently. His name and example became known across prisoner of war compounds, known to men from many nations and units who recorded what they had witnessed when they eventually came home. He was forced to march 300 kilometers in freezing conditions to the Yalu River. He became, in the accounts of those who walked beside him, progressively weaker without becoming less himself. Fellow prisoner Ron Guthrie was with Madden in the final weeks. Guthrie recalled that Madden resembled a skeleton with skin stretched over the surface, but kept saying the same thing. "I'm going to make it, Ron." He did not make it. Horace William Madden died of malnutrition on approximately the 6th of November, 1951, 7 months after Kapyong. In 1955, he was awarded the George Cross posthumously. The citation reads in part, "It would have been apparent to Private Madden that to pursue this course must eventually result in his death. This did not deter him. And this gallant soldier's outstanding heroism was an inspiration to all his fellow prisoners." The George Cross is the highest decoration earned by any Australian in the Korean War. The man who earned it did not fire a shot after the 24th of April, 1951. The United States Presidential Unit Citation was awarded to the 3rd Battalion, Royal Australian Regiment, and to the 2nd Battalion, Princess Patricia's Canadian Light Infantry, on the 4th of December, 1951. It was presented personally by General James Van Fleet, commanding the United States 8th Army. It was the first time in history that a Canadian unit had been so honored. Company A of the 79th 2nd United States Heavy Tank Battalion was cited alongside the infantry. The language of the citation is the documented American assessment of what Kapyong produced. It states that the positions were completely surrounded, and that again and again the enemy threw waves of troops at the gallant defenders, and many times succeeded in penetrating the outer defenses, but each time the courageous, indomitable, and determined soldiers repulsed the fanatical attacks. It states that the actions of those cited displayed such gallantry, determination, and esprit de corps in accomplishing their mission as to set them apart and above other units participating in the campaign. And it states that the seriousness of the breakthrough on the Central Front had been changed from defeat to victory by the gallant stand of these heroic and courageous soldiers, changed from defeat to victory. That is the formal American verdict on what 700 Australians and 700 Canadians produced on 2 hills in a valley 60 kilometers northeast of Seoul. Captain Reg Saunders had his own verdict, delivered after the fighting ended. "At last I felt like an Anzac," he said, "and I imagine there were 600 others like me." The sentence requires its context. The context is a man commissioned by an army formally concerned about the special significance of that commissioning. A man who had returned from the Second World War to a society that declined to extend him what it extended to his fellow veterans. A man whose brother was dead, and whose uncle was dead, and whose grandfather had served a country that would not grant this descendant full citizenship. That man, on a hill in Korea, having held his company through wave attacks in the dark, said that at last he felt like an Anzac. The weight of "at last" in that sentence belongs to the reader. The full consequence of those 48 hours became visible in the weeks that followed. The Chinese spring offensive collapsed by the end of April, not in the Kapyong sector alone, but across the entire front. The western axis provides the measure of scale. At the Imjin River the same weekend, the British 29th Brigade had stood against the main Chinese thrust towards Seoul. The 1st Battalion Gloucestershire Regiment held a position until it was functionally destroyed. Approximately 42 men returned to Allied lines from a battalion of 800. They fought their guns to the last barrel. The 29th Brigade suffered 1,091 casualties in total and inflicted enormous losses on the Chinese 63rd Army. The Western Stand and the Central Stand broke the momentum of an offensive designed to end the war in China's favor. Both battles happened simultaneously. Neither could have produced the result that both together achieved. By late May of 1951, United Nations forces had pushed north of the 38th parallel again. From that point, the Korean War became what it would remain until the armistice in July of 1953, a conflict of patrols and attrition, of static positions and negotiated adjustments, rather than the large-scale offensive warfare of its first year. The front stabilized. Peace talks began in July of 1951. The line from which those talks proceeded was a line that had been held, in part, at Kapyong. Military academy instructors have since assessed the battle using a specific phrase recorded in multiple accounts of how it is taught: the perfect defensive battle. Michael Kelly, a historian in the military history section of the Australian War Memorial, published an analysis of the engagement in the International History Review in February of 2025, arguing that it is a model of inter-allied cooperation that is as relevant today as it was in 1951. Seoul did not fall a fourth time. Route 17 still runs through the Kapyong Valley. The city at its southern end has a population today of approximately 10 million people. The 27th British Commonwealth Brigade was withdrawn from Korea after Kapyong. The 3rd Battalion was not. Taken on the strength of the newly formed 28th British Commonwealth Brigade, the battalion remained in Korea through the Battle of Mariang-san in October of 1951 and through the final years of the conflict until the armistice. It was there at the beginning, the middle, and the end of the war. Old Faithful. Ferguson was relieved of command of the battalion on the 5th of July, 1951, after 8 months in that role. He received the Distinguished Service Order. He commanded the 1st Battalion, Royal Australian Regiment, and later the 13th National Service Training Battalion. He died on the 21st of December, 1988. Saunders came home from Korea to the same Australia he had left. His first marriage did not survive the absence. A second marriage also ended in divorce. He had 10 children. He worked in logging in Gippsland, moved to Sydney, spent 11 years with the Austral Bronze Company. The skills that had made him capable of leading a rifle company through the worst night of Kapyong found no obvious civilian equivalent. In 1969, the Australian government appointed him as one of the first Aboriginal liaison officers in the newly formed Office of Aboriginal Affairs. The man who had held ground on Hill 504, now mediating between a government and the communities it had spent generations excluding. He was awarded the MBE in 1971 for that work. He joined the Council of the Australian War Memorial in 1985. He died on the 2nd of March, 1990, in Canberra. His ashes were scattered at Lake Conda, where his father had brought him after his mother's death in 1924, where his grandmother raised him and his brother, his family's country. He had carried that country with him to North Africa, and Greece, and Crete, and New Guinea, and Korea, and back again across 4 decades. Harry Gordon, who wrote his biography, observed that Saunders was accepted by the men who served with him because false values do not flourish among frontline soldiers. What that implies about where false values do flourish is not stated. It does not need to be. Private Madden's name is on the soldiers' canteen at the 3rd Battalion's base, the Slim Madden Soldiers Club, named for him by a commanding officer who later told the Australian Parliament he was very proud of that. Soldiers who never met him eat their meals in a room bearing his name. The George Cross he received in 1955, the highest award earned by any Australian in the Korean War, was earned by a former mental health nurse who gave away his food, refused to stop defying the men who were killing him for it, and died doing both. The Korean War as a whole occupies an unusual position in Australian national memory, which is to say, very nearly no position at all. A senator observing the state of public knowledge noted from the floor of Parliament what surveys had confirmed. Apart from episodes of Mass H, he said, Australians have very little knowledge of the Korean War. They do not know why it began. 18,000 Australians served in it. 340 were killed. The numbers are not small. They are not what explains the silence. The silence has a different explanation. Gallipoli is the cornerstone of the Anzac story, a landing in 1915 that failed, that cost 8,700 Australian lives, that achieved none of its military objectives, and that returns to Australian public consciousness every year on the 25th of April, with a national ceremony that grows rather than diminishes. Kapyong is not in that consciousness, a battle that prevented the fall of a capital city, that produced the documented American assessment of a defeat changed to victory, that military academies study as a model of defensive warfare. 32 Australians killed, a footnote in the same account. National mythologies are not always rational about which stories they decide to carry forward. Heroic failure travels further than decisive success. The valley north of Kapyong in South Korea is farmland today. Hill 504 is where it was. The Korean War Memorial stands above the ground where A Company and D Company held through the night of the 23rd. The 75th anniversary of the battle was marked in April of 2026, when soldiers from the 3rd Battalion in Townsville made the journey south to stand on the ground their predecessors had stood on. Major Matt Rose, who had served 35 years in the Australian Army and 15 of those with the 3rd Battalion, said something about what the battalion's name means to the people who carry it now. Old Faithful is not a badge of honor, he said. It's a burden of expectation. The Royal Australian Mint issued a commemorative 50-cent coin for the anniversary. It carries 32 poppies in the design, one for each man killed. The coordinates of the battle are pressed into the metal. Reg Saunders's medals are in the Korea Gallery of the Australian War Memorial. The battle honor Kapyong is on the colors of every battalion of the Royal Australian Regiment. The Slim Madden Soldiers Club is at the base in Townsville, where soldiers who never knew him go about their days. 700 men were given a position too wide to hold, with support that left without orders and artillery that could not be registered before dark, against an enemy of perhaps 20,000. A general told them by radio that they had been wiped out. The road to Seoul remained closed. The city did not fall for a 4th time. Those are the verifiable facts of the matter. The men who produced them did not choose the ground they were put on. They chose what to do when they got there. If this story belongs somewhere beyond the footnotes, where it has spent the last 75 years, share it with someone who hasn't heard it. The 32 poppies are on the coin. Each one was a name. The ground at Kapyong grows crops now, in the way that ground does across enough time, without announcement, and without forgetting what was asked of it.